Welcome to another episode of Rethinking Freedom. I am your host, Aya Baranelli, and today, the last day of Women's History Month, although we know every day is Women's History Month, we are bringing you another episode on an amazing woman that we should all know about. And I think that as you listen to her life and her contributions, it is instructive of how each of us can show up today in our current political climate to courageously fight back against those powers that might choose to silence us or choose to deny us our common humanity. So enjoy a little bit of information on the great Lorraine Hansberry, and please like, subscribe, and share from our Rethinking Freedom YouTube channel, and leave your comments. Let us know if you learned anything from this episode and if you were inspired by what you learned.
Greetings, and welcome again to Women and Resistance. And today, as usual, I have with me Sister Aya Fubara Eneli Esquire, who has taken this thing to a different new level. Yes, our woman for today would be playwright Lorraine Hansberry. And so, without further ado, first question would be, would you like to say something before we proceed? I mean, my manners.
Well, good evening. What is it that your friends call you?
My name is Adesoji Iginla, and yes, I am the host, or one of the hosts for Women and Resistance. And
I may call you Adesoji then?
Yes, you can.
Well, thank you for having me on today.
You're welcome. I take it you're comfortable. You have an ashtray next to you. We won't want to start a fire, would we?
I have my ashtray and I actually have my drink as well.
Okay. Make yourself feel at home.
Thank you.
So, without further ado, could you tell us a bit about Lorraine Hansberry?
You want me to tell you a little bit about myself? Well, where do we start? I was born Lorraine Vivian Hansberry. I am the last of 4 children born to my parents. And I was born on the south side of Chicago at a time that was just really a desperate time for Black people in America, the United States of America, born into segregation and discrimination, and a time when it was really difficult for Black people to dream and to see their dreams come to pass.
Okay. So we're talking about the 1930s now. This is...
Yes, I was born on May 19, 1930. It's a very special day, not just because that's the day I was born. It also happens to be the birth date of someone we know pretty well, Malcolm X.
Yep. Yes. Speaking of, that great tradition of having our Black giants moving in sync with each other, what would you say was Lorraine's upbringing like?
To go back down that lane, well, I was born into what would be considered a middle-class family. Of course, a Negro family at the time. My parents had migrated from the South up to Chicago looking for a better life, and both my parents were college educated. You may also have heard of my uncle, William Hansberry, who studied under G.E. Du Bois, and it was my great honor to eventually be a student of his as well, though not in a class setting, as it were. My older siblings were significantly older than me. My sister was about 9 years older than me. And so I learned to keep my own company. I loved reading. I was very curious about the world around me. My childhood, despite our access to income, was not idyllic by any stretch of the imagination.
We're talking segregation now. Segregation times?
We're talking segregation. We're talking a time where there was only a particular area in Chicago
where Black families were allowed to live could rent because there were actually covenants in place in most of Chicago that prevented Black people from being able to purchase or to rent, even if they had the money.
Mm.
And my father was an entrepreneur. He actually started a bank,
Mm.
and soon after that went into the real estate business
Mm.
and was quite innovative because he figured out a way to
Maximize
provide more
space.
housing. Yes, well, you can say that, but his goal was to provide more housing options
Uh-huh.
for Black people. So he would purchase buildings and then he would set up partitions, if you will. They were called like kitchenettes, and it wasn't a whole lot of room, but it did give the Negro people, the Black people, a lot more options in terms of even being able to get housing at all. And that was a source of quite a bit of his fortune. I recall a story as a child. It was Christmas, and my mother had bought me this fur coat. It was
The Emin fur coat.
all white, and I was a pretty simple child in terms of my tastes, and I did not like that coat. It reminded me of a rabbit. But my mother wanted me to put it on and wanted me to prance around and for everybody to ooh and ah over this coat, which I can imagine cost, quite a pretty penny. And when I went to school, because of where we lived, I was one of a handful of Black students who actually attended that school, Betty Ross. It was a predominantly white school. And I got beaten up for wearing that coat. They beat
What?
me up. They beat me down. They got the coat all dirty because I was not staying in my place. And some of the students, it felt like I was putting on airs, including the Black students.
Mm.
We finally moved to a part of town that ended up in the Supreme Court case, Hansberry v. Lee, that did not end covenant restrictions, but it did eventually, after much agitation, the NAACP actually came out in support of us, and we kept appealing until we got to the Supreme Court. It ended up allowing us to move back into that house because we actually were initially evicted by a lower court. But living in that neighborhood, it was horrible. I couldn't go out to play with the other kids in the neighborhood who were white.
Mm.
I got beaten up most times going to and from school.
Can you recall any incident that stood out to you whilst you were growing up in terms of mob, quote unquote?
Well, there were so many incidents. It was a pretty scary time. We actually had protection in our home. My parents had hired a man a number of people, but I particularly recall this time where there was a mob that
Mm.
was gathering outside, and my mother and this man, my father wasn't home, ushered me back into indoors to protect me. And brick was thrown through our window. It was thrown so hard, it shattered the window and embedded itself in a wall in our home and just narrowly missed my head. I
Was the
recall nights when my mother was patrolling the house trying to protect her children with a gun in her hand, a Luger to be more specific.
wow?
I recall having a sense of not knowing if it was worth it and definitely not feeling like my mother had the protection that she needed, at times when my father wasn't around where, like a Black woman, she did what she needed to do to protect her children and to protect her home.
Okay. So obviously we know she sort of saw the home as being on the siege. The fact that she
It definitely was.
So the fact that the home was attacked repeatedly and she finally got a chance to go off to university, University of Wisconsin to be fact. What would you say was her abiding reminder of home when she got to Wisconsin?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you are asking specifically. There were a lot of things that happened prior to me even going off to the University of Wisconsin. Of course, my older sister had gone to Howard, and that was my mother's preference that I go to Howard. My father had invested in an oil business and essentially been swindled out of his investment. There was a lot of stress on him. He created an organization to try to provide different opportunities for Black people. My people were race people. We were never to turn our back on our family and definitely never to turn our back on our race. And my father was so harried and came to an understanding that there really was no place for the Black man, for the Black person, Black family, to find rest and comfort in the United States of America. And so he actually bought a home in Mexico. And he had gone down with my mother. They drove down to Mexico, I guess, to get things set up. And unfortunately, he never returned. He had a heart attack and he passed away on another pretty significant date in my life, which is March 10th. That is a date that has brought me
Fame,
deep sorrow, but also freedom as well. March 10th was the date that my father died. March 10th was also the date that my play, A Raisin in the Sun, debuted on Broadway. And March 10th was also the day that I finalized my divorce to my husband. But I made the decision to go to the University of Wisconsin instead. I had done some research. I was interested in the programs that they had there, and getting there and even finding a place to live was interesting. Not get housing on campus, and eventually did find a place where there was a woman who took in young ladies. And my brother and sister who had taken me up there did something that was quite smart at the time, which was the lady was not at home. And so rather than wait and give her an opportunity to say that I would not be welcome there, they left me there with my luggage and they went back to Chicago. And so by the time, as a Black person in America, you learn to be creative.
Creative, yep.
And so by the time the lady returned, here I was. And she basically left it up to the other girls in the house to decide whether I could stay. We had a dinner and it was an audition of sorts, but I was used to being in various environments given the schools that I had also attended. And I was quite charming. Knew the right things to say. And ultimately, yes, I not just enrolled at the university, but I stayed there as well. Yes.
Okay, so you've mentioned the Raisin in the Sun, exploring the themes of the play. Would you say the play was a metaphor for your life, or would you say it's an observation of the American experience?
Well, there has been so much written about that play. That was an award-winning play. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the awards that I received from that play. And of course, I was still a very young woman. I was a young woman when I died, but I was a very young woman when that play debuted. I was 28 years old, the first Black woman to
have a play on Broadway?
Play on Broadway, yes. And lots of speculation about that play. Certainly, as an artist, as a writer, I drew on the things that were familiar to me. And so the family that is reflected in the play is definitely a Black family. It's a Black family specifically in Chicago. It's a Black family specifically on the south side of Chicago. And so, yes, I drew on my experiences. Certainly the daughter who aspired to become a doctor in the play, as some could argue, and I would not dissuade them of that argument, that she was loosely based on me. Of course, one of her suitors was an African young man, I guess, similar to you. And that was also based on just my readings. I was a voracious reader, and I studied not just art and drama and writing, but I was very concerned about politics and colonialism and Africa, what was happening in Africa was very important to me. And these were not things that were widely covered. And so these were areas of interest to me. I ended up working with Paul Robeson. Actually, I was an editor for his newspaper, Freedom Ways. And
yeah.
as I said earlier, I worked with B.E.B. Du Bois. I got to meet people like John Henry Clark. Of course, Nina Simone and I became good friends, as did Jimmy. The rest of you may know him as James Baldwin.
James Baldwin, yep.
Of mine. But yes, definitely the play drew on my experiences living on the south side of Chicago. That there's been some controversy about my playwriting and my activism. Harold Cruz, in his book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, actually takes me to task quite a bit, not just me, but most writers of that day, because he felt like we were, I would say, unimaginative, maybe not creative enough, maybe that we were basing our writing on philosophies that weren't ours. You know, at that point in American history, we're now talking in the thesis. You're looking at MacArthurism, you're looking at all the charges about being communist. And of course, many of us who spoke out ended up with FBI files. And I happen to be one of the people in that group, although they clearly did not know as much about me as they thought that they did. But those were heady times. You know, I went to University of Wisconsin to study art and drama. I dropped out a couple years later, wanted a different kind of education. I came back to Chicago to stay at my parents' home. And my mother was definitely hoping I would continue school and to get married and settle into a middle-class Negro life, if you will. But I wanted more. And I did take a course while I was in Chicago. I dropped out of that as well and eventually convinced my mother to let me go to New York City. Yes.
Okay.
And that was quite a heady time for a young woman.
Okay, so let's explore the part of, because we're talking the 50s now. So let's explore the part where you obviously are a communist and...
Was I?
Well, that's the understanding that people looking at the way you move in terms of your activism and the fact that you didn't seem to dissuade people from thinking that's the case. So one would...
Well, people had a lot of thoughts about me. I mean, at one point I traveled to Uruguay and I actually represented Paul Robeson at a conference because his passport had been revoked. E.B. Du Bois' passport had also been revoked. As a matter of fact, at the time that I worked with him, he had been so maligned that even most respectable Black people did not want anything to do with him. He was actually struggling at that time even to provide for himself.
Yeah.
So those are accusations. I don't feel like I need to dignify it one way or another.
Okay. I won't take you to tax on that. Okay, so...
And I cannot, even though I am trying to be Lorraine Hansberry, holding this cigarette in my hand is a lot of work. So for those of you who are smokers out there, this is a lot of work. Keep wanting to put it down.
Yeah, can you imagine? You have to light it up,
And at some point, I'm going to have to put my glasses on. Lorraine did not wear glasses because she was still so young when she died, but I need my glasses to be able to read my notes. But
okay,
let's continue. I can't wait to hear what the audience has to say about all of this. Please give us your comments. Tell us what you're thinking. Yes. Okay. I'm back to Lorraine.
Do engage in the chat. Yes. We're talking about her stay in New York now, looking at her, the way she moved in New York. There was a part that in reading her papers that even raising in the sun almost never happened because she suffered from depression.
This might be a good time for me to share some of my thoughts. So I'm going to read this as Lorraine without my glasses on. God help us all. Eventually, it comes to you. The thing that makes you exceptional, if you are at all, is eventually that which must also make you lonely. Although in a lot of ways I'm being celebrated today, it was a lonely existence. was I did not often feel like I could be my full self. I could be truly understood. And like all young women coming of age, and coming of age in New York City of all places, I initially moved to Greenwich, which was quite cosmopolitan, a lot more racial integration, if you will. A lot of communists and their children. And it wasn't until later that I actually started to move into Harlem. But even then, it was, I would say, under the protection, if you will, of the communists at the time. And so certainly some criticism has been leveled against me that I really did not have an understanding of what the common person went through, the Mexican American, which is the term we use now, but we called ourselves Negroes at the
Negroes, yeah.
time, experience. But, I remember being on 125th Street and giving speeches, and I feel I did my best to talk with my people, to understand my people. I met a young man, we called him Rosie, and we actually lived together. He got to meet my family, and I realized that although he was an activist, he was very much enamored with middle-class trappings and materialism.
Mm.
Unfortunately, he ultimately also became a heroin addict to the extent that it cost us where we lived. I got evicted, and we were going to get married at one point. But he actually already had a wife, unbeknownst to me. That was definitely a heartbreaking situation for a young woman, but most young people at some point will experience something of that nature. And it was actually shortly after that that I met the man who would become my husband, whom I call Bobby.
Okay. Hold that thought with regards to Bobby. Let's explore the aspect of understanding what the common man or the common Negro's man's life is in the United States based on her background, which in a sense is quite a bit of a complexity in the sense that you're trying to mirror something that you clearly are not. Some would say, what's the word? Cosplay.
Well, I am offended by that. Let's address the elephant in the room.
Okay.
I'm well aware that in some quarters, people considered my father a slumlord. He was a race man who wanted to do right by himself and his family, and he also wanted to make things better for the Negro people. I feel like he was very much misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
The housing market, the housing situation was very difficult in Chicago. And when you have that many people crammed into small places, it's very easy to have code violations.
Uh-huh.
And the city of Chicago harassed and targeted landlords like my father with numerous code violations as a way to try to diminish him and to diminish Black people. And I take umbrage at anyone who would say that my father or my family, or even I by extension, since I was a partner on paper
Uh-huh.
for some of those properties, and I
Yeah.
did receive income for quite some time from some of those properties. I take umbrage at anyone who would say that we were exploiting our own. This is a capitalist society, and my parents, who remained Republicans, were doing their best to achieve the American dream.
Okay.
Now, certainly, I chose to live my life a little differently, and that's why I moved to New York.
Uh-huh.
But A Raisin in the Sun and most of my writing shows exactly where my heart was, and my heart is for our people, for the
Okay.
Negro race. Yes.
Okay. So obviously you put your political leanings into your writings and your activism represents that.
Yes.
So how do you justify the fact that whilst you're doing that, your father business was also exploiting people not 4 times, but sometimes 100 times the price of the normal rent? How do you reconcile the two? Because here we have an activist penning thoughts, the American thoughts, onto paper putting on the stage in front of people, representing their grievances with society, or still partaking in the same grievance, but this time on the side of the oppressor.
It's unfortunate that we have an opportunity to talk about my life and the ways that I contributed, which are still relevant today.
Yeah.
Some people describe me as someone who was ahead of her time, and that you want to focus on something that I've clearly debunked already.
No, yes.
The issue is the housing situation for Black people moving north in particular was precarious. I think that those people would have preferred a roof over their heads than to be out on the streets, and that's a service my father provided.
Yeah, I am not doubting the needs were met. I'm just sort of exploring how one can possibly reconcile the two. But
But that's what makes human beings the complex beings that we are. And that there's always that conflict, and we're always growing and evolving and challenging things. And yes, so in New York, I marched and I spoke out for tenement rights. I fought for the rights of Negro people. And looking back now, you could certainly, I suppose, and you are making the argument that maybe I could have been more vocal with my family and our dealings. But again, I think you do me a disservice. Died at age 34. I was the youngest in my family. My family had experienced a lot of trauma. And I think most of us can relate to sometimes not always being in sync with our families, but that's our family anyway.
Yeah.
And families forever. I would like to focus on some of the things that I did.
Okay. No, I was going to go there because, you've laid that to rest in terms of your reconciling, even though
my father in his own right was a revolutionary, and that was something that I aspired to be as well. And so in 1959, I made history as the first Black woman to have a play produced on Broadway with A Raisin in the Sun.
Yeah.
It's about a Black family's struggle and their resilience. This play went on to win the New York Drama Critics Circle Award, making me the first Black playwright and the youngest recipient of that prestigious award. And it wasn't easy to do this. As you had brought up earlier, I battled depression for most of my life. I moved quite a bit just trying to make ends meet. I worked as a waitress. I did what was required to make a living, but also to fight for my people. Now, I did get a lucky break, if you want to call it that, because my husband,
Robert,
interesting enough, well, I call him Bobby, but yes, my husband actually ended up coming into quite a bit of fortune when a song that he wrote to a calypso, it was a calypso song, calypso was the rage at the time. You would recall Harry Belafonte had some hits at the time. And the song was called Cindy Oh Cindy, and it was actually based on a song from my people, the Gulagichi people, for people of the Negro race, a work song, and they put the melody of that song in words and put it to a calypso beat. I suppose, again, one could say here comes a group of people capitalizing on the culture of the Negro race. But at any rate, he and his partner put out the song. It ended up being recorded by people like Ed Fisher, and it did very well. And based on the royalties from that, I was able to stop working and looking for a way to make a living, particularly after Freedom Way's paper was closed for lack of funding. And I was able to focus on my writing in spite of all of the other challenges. And so my work was more than just theater. It was a statement. It was a demand for dignity. It was a reflection of the realities faced by Black families back then. And it was something that had never been seen before. As much as I can recall, on Broadway in that way. And of course, Sidney Poitier was acted in it for, I think, probably like the first 190 outings of
Episodes.
the
Yeah.
play. And then eventually Osa Davis took over in that role, and Ruby Dee was in that role, was in that play as well. And it was just groundbreaking beyond the theater and the stage. And of course, after, unfortunately, my death and dying much earlier than I anticipated that I would, in addition to that play and other plays that were later either published based on my work, what I had written, plays that I had actually worked on, like Sidney Brunstein's Window. My husband also, although people didn't realize until after I died that we had actually gotten divorced, also was able to put out a play called To Be Young, Gifted, and Black, which also went on to do very well. And of course, there is the song that was written by my dear, dear friend, Nina Simone,
Nina Simone.
also titled To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. I certainly encourage all of your listeners to go and revisit that song. But beyond the stage, I was deeply engaged in the rights, the fight for Negro people across the world. You know, I wrote about Kwame Nkrumah, and I was very deeply disturbed by the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. I met with Robert F. Kennedy, James Baldwin, and other, I guess you would call us, Black intellectuals, to push for real change. I did fundraisers for SNCC. And actually, if you recall the story of the three young men who were killed in the South.
Yeah, the Freedom Riders.
Yes, before they found their bodies, they found a car, a station wagon. And that was a station wagon that had been purchased with some of the proceeds from a fundraiser that I had done for SNCC. And that would just hurt me to my core. I actually wrote this in my diary. Do I remain a revolutionary? Intellectually, without a doubt. But am I prepared to give my body to the struggle or even my comfort? I had hoped that once I got better, that I too, like my friend Jimmy, would go down to the South and put my body on the line to back up what I said I believed and what I wrote about. But that was not meant to be.
To be, yeah. Okay. Speaking of putting one's body on the line, it was said that, she said, and I quote, homophobia was a philosophical active anti-feminist dogma. Because she subscribed to the latter, the first national lesbian publication. Now we're delving into some of the complexities of your life. And she proceeds and says how someone wrote a piece in the ladder saying how lesbians should dress and act. And she retorted in a letter to the editor that as a child of a Black elite, she wrote, she had been taught how to dress and act for the dominant social group. It has not changed which hotels would deny her entrance or stop the cops from snaring at her mother when a brick shatters her window. Appeasement, Hansberry believed, won't get you very far. Her demand was freedom and nothing less. Would you say you subscribe to that view?
Absolutely. I absolutely believe that we should be fighting back. Like Malcolm X said, the ballot or the bullet. I mean, like, we should be fighting back. There's no way that this country is never going to change for Black people just trying to appease whiteness. That's just not going to work. For all my fame and I guess you would say fortune, when I traveled with, shall we say, a female friend of mine, we were denied a room. And it was perceived, even though we had reservations, and you and I can both speculate as to why that was.
Now, it's also important that we understand how supportive your husband was.
Well, but before we talk about my husband, and he was my best friend, who's very, very important in my life, and certainly we may not be having this conversation today, but for his devotion, his dedication to keeping my legacy alive. Since you're always looking for the salacious, so much so that 3 years after our divorce, he married another Black woman, very accomplished in her own right. And together, they dedicated themselves to going through my papers, eventually donating some, not all of my papers to the Schomburg Library. Of course, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black came out. That was all due to the efforts of Bobby. And today, their daughter is actually the trustee for my foundation.
Okay.
And so clearly he loved me and was devoted to me. When we talk about freedom, which was the thing that I was always angling for Black people, but also for me as a woman, for women as a whole, I was very much impacted by a book written by Simone de Beauvoir, I believe it was The Second Sex. And didn't agree with everything she had on there, she had in the book. But it did make me think about this notion of freedom. And since you brought up the latter, and what rights we have to live authentically, to be fully who we are. As a young woman, there were certainly times when I was very much struck by my attraction to other women, which of course was something that would have been considered a taboo. And so in this day and age now, where there are now spaces, although still being threatened, where a Black person can be Black, can be woman, and can be lesbian, those spaces weren't quite as readily available in my time.
Okay, if we're still to explore the political angle of your personality, you took umbrage with the vice president of the New York chapter of the NAACP for buckling under the, well, you claim you're not, but you accuse the New York chapter of buckling under the pressure of the anti-communist pressure, when one of them even shouted down Paul Robeson during a panel that was specifically to help Black people find jobs in radio and television. Would you say you still hold that view with regards to the NAACP being outmoded, as you put it?
Definitely at the time of my death, yes, I felt very strongly about that. I mean, it was just absolutely disgraceful what they did to W.B. Du Bois, wasn't it? Certainly you would agree with me on that count. The shocking and jiving on any level is not something that I can stomach, which is why with all my characters, I gave them that dignity. In fact, that was my issue with Porgy and Bess, which was a Broadway show that had done very, very well prior to A Raisin in the Sun. And it was building lives on caricatures and stereotypes and basically robbing us of our full humanity. And if that story were to be told, it should be told by us. And so looking back now, if I were still living today and I would, have had the gift of hindsight, definitely I think that the times that we're in show that the NAACP has largely been ineffective. I'm not opposed to what little good that they've done, but I would say now that even though I was aligned to some degree with the Marxists and the communists, that they too, looking back now, were problematic because it seems like in every instance, white people just want to control us. It's, we can have freedom, but only on their terms. And so even with the communists, they decided who was part of the in-group. And to that degree, I would agree with Harold Cruz's sometimes very strident criticisms of me and other Black intellectuals of the time, because our philosophies weren't ours. In fact, let me read from something that he wrote, of course, long after I had passed on, at which point I am going to have to put my glasses on. Okay. Harold Cruz wrote, "First off, the Negro creative intellectual as writer, artist, and critic has no cultural philosophy, no cultural methodology, no literary and cultural critique on himself, his people, or on America. Hence, he cannot create, establish, and maintain a code of cultural ethics, an artistic standard, a critical yardstick, or any kind of cogent and meaningful critique on society that might enable him to fashion viable and lasting institutions in the cultural spheres that motivate progressive movements." We still today are dependent on white people to tell us what is
Validation.
possible and what the parameters are, and that is a problem. Whether we're talking about the Negro race here, Black people in the United States of America, or in the UK where you are, anywhere in the diaspora, and unfortunately, even on the continent. We just have not expanded our imaginations beyond the confines of Western philosophy to our great detriment. But I
You
say all of this to say this. There was a documentary that recently came out about my life. I'm very grateful for people who are researching my papers.
uh-huh.
As you know, I alluded earlier to the fact that initially Bobby Nernhoff, that was my husband, had donated some of my papers to the Schomburg, in keeping with my desires that my papers were readily accessible to my people. So hopefully you all have heard of Arturo Schomburg. But it was important to him to only tell part of the story, because not to any way invalidate what he meant to me, or how he has kept my legacy going. But it was important to him to, even after my death, continue to curate me in a way that he hoped would be more palatable to the people and to my race as well. And so he kept out all of the papers that in any way demonstrated that I was a lesbian. And in my papers, I described myself as a heterosexual married lesbian. And it wasn't until after his death that his wife actually donated the rest of the papers to the Schomburg. And to that extent, I am grateful that she is letting me be seen as my full self. But I say all of this to say I was going to talk about this documentary that is called Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart, and they got it from my words as well. I'm going to presume that there will still be other writings
Of
about
course,
me,
of course, of course.
because although I died so young, I was committed to thinking. I was committed to exploring. I was committed to challenging myself. And yes, I was a complex human being, and I would argue so are all of you watching and listening. So don't just look at me as a pariah. But I said this in my writing. I say all of this to say that one cannot live with sighted eyes and feeling hearts and not know and react to the miseries which afflict this world. I think that the human race does command its own destiny, and that destiny can eventually embrace the stars. And that's how I looked at the world, and I looked at the different aspects of myself as I gave myself permission to explore.
Charles Sheeds also wrote a book titled, what's the title of the book again? It's titled Lorraine Hansberry, The Life Behind a Raisin in the Sun.
Yeah.
The title of the book again is Charles J. Shield. And in it, it said, reason depends on the tension produced by such a shock. So we're talking about the American experience now. It admits a fact denied by people of many races and politics. What a particular black person wants may not always be consonant with freedom. American history has placed such weight on the meaning of those wants that it can be hard to look at them straight on. And then he goes on to give you kudos. And he says, one thing Hansberry never did was turn away. Would you say that's an accurate depiction?
I never did. I grappled with it all, perhaps with too many cigarettes and too much alcohol, but I was fully present and not afraid to face my own demons, even when I was afraid to face them.
So it must be said that in the course of your writing, when did you discover USA?
I had these stomach pains for quite some time. And at one point, the doctors said I was anemic. And, it was a period where for like 5 weeks, I didn't drink and I didn't smoke. And those were interesting days. But it wasn't until long after the play was the play initially debuted. I believe it was about 1963 in particular, where I was now told that I needed to undergo surgery. And that first surgery was successful, we thought. And I went on to buy a new property. I should say this, and forgive me for moving a little bit away from your question, I'm going to come back to it. After the very successful run of that play, A Raisin in the
A
Sun,
Raisin in the Sun.
initially the powers that be did not want to fund that play. It really took cobbling together a few dollars here and there and so on and so forth to make it happen. And we ended up having to go off Broadway first to really prove that there was a market. So it was shown in Chicago as well before it now debuted on Broadway. But the success of the play was such that it was optioned by Hollywood for a movie. And we negotiated for me to be the screenwriter for that movie, which again was unheard of. I had no particular expertise in that area. They paid me $50,000 just to be the writer for that script, in addition to about $300,000, I believe, for the option for the movie. And I worked really hard to make sure that it stayed true to my vision, although there were many changes that they made even during production and then again during the editing process. But I'm proud of how it turned out. But from those proceeds, as you can imagine, I was in a good place financially. And I ended up buying a place about 40 miles outside of New York City. And I called it Chitlin Estate. Yes. But yes, and so it was during this time that I recognized that I did have an illness. In fact, initially the doctors would not tell me that it was cancer until we got to a point where it was really not much that they could do for me. But I had some dear friends, like Nina Simone. She came to the hospital. She actually brought her controller with her so that I could hear her music, and definitely surrounded by a lot of love during that.
Your friends also took up a collection whilst you were in hospital, although not to pay for your care, but it was to keep your play, Sidney Bronstein's Window, running.
Yes.
So the play will close on January 12, 1965, in the evening.
Which was the same day that I died.
Yes. At age 34 years old.
Looking
back at such a short run, bearing in mind, Raisin in the Sun came out when you were 28. So technically, you were only 6 years in the limelight. Looking at that 6 years, what would you say you want to be remembered for?
Those were heady times. I didn't necessarily seek out fame, but I'll tell you what, I responded to as many of the fans as I could. I was getting offers to speak at so many different events, and I went to as many as I could. I particularly liked to engage with the young people because I wanted to infuse this sense of hope and also this sense of responsibility. We have a responsibility to ourselves. We have a responsibility to our race. Well, something that was definitely instilled in me by my parents. I have to tell this story. I don't have much love for him, Robert F. Kennedy, at the time, but the civil rights movement raging and Black people being brutalized on the South, he just wanted to make it go away. And so I got a call from Jimmy, my good friend James Baldwin, and Jimmy and I had a lot in common. But Jimmy said, Robert F. Kennedy wanted to meet with some of us. And we met at an apartment that they owned in New York City. And I really did not have time for the shenanigans, if you will. He was very dismissive of a young man who was there, who had actually been beaten up and had come to New York City. BT was one of the freedom riders and had come to New York City to get some treatment. And he wanted to disregard him and basically talk to those of us, more forward-facing, if you will, more famous Black so-called intellectuals. And I gave him a talking to. I told him the person he needed to speak to was that young gentleman and that we would not be used in that way. This was in 1963 and that the country and he in his role needed to stand up and protect Black people. And once I was done with my say, I walked out, and I think the rest of the people walked out with me. What do I want to be remembered for? I want to be remembered as a deep thinker. I want to be remembered as someone who was a revolutionary, who was willing to, though I never had the chance to live it out as fully as I wanted to, I was willing to put my body on the line for what I believed, which is the freedom of Black people across the globe.
Mm.
I want to be remembered as a woman who was courageous enough to be free. I want to be remembered for someone who loved deeply and wanted to be loved. You know, growing up, my mother wasn't very demonstrative in terms of affection. You know, when you got sick, yes, you know, you would get cuddled a little bit more and you know, be nursed back. But perhaps it was the times and the fact that she had to be so strong. But I did not get the love that I wanted. And being married to my husband, I also did not feel like we were sexually as compatible as I would have desired.
Mm.
And so I would also like to be remembered as a woman who did not allow herself to be constrained, but was courageous enough to be her full self. I do want to share quickly, you know, just for those who may not know, as I've stated earlier, I was the first Black woman to have a play produced on Broadway, A Raisin in the Sun in 1959. I've told you about the New York Drama Critics Circle Award, which I got at age 29. I also received Tony Award nominations in 1960 and posthumously in 2022. My play was nominated for Best Play at the 1960 Tony Awards.
Mm.
In 2022, the Broadway revival of The Sign in Sidney Brunstein's Window earned multiple Tony nominations. Raisin in the Sun, of course, was adapted into major films in 1961 and 1989, and again in 2008, reintroducing my work to millions worldwide. In 2008, the ABC TV adaptation of my play won multiple NAACP Image Awards and was nominated for 3 Primetime Emmy Awards. As I said, I was a financial supporter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I also, in 1969, Simone honored me when she wrote the song and performed it, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. And that, I still want Black people to hold on to that. How amazing it is to be young, to be gifted, and to be Black. 2013, U.S. Postal Service issued a Lorraine Hansberry Forever stamp as part of the Black Heritage Series. In 2010, I was inducted into the Chicago Literary Hall of Fame. Wow. Moved up from the south side of Chicago. Part of my legacy includes the Hansberry Theater in San Francisco, which was opened in 1981 and is still there. Revival of my works, LeBlanc's, The Sign in Sidney Brunstein's Window, and my essays continue to be studied and performed. And in 2022, the Broadway revival of The Sign in Sidney Brunstein's Window reintroduced me to a whole new generation. There are also so many books by me and other books that have been written about me. So, of course, if you're going to talk about me, I'm looking for it right here.
Yep.
You definitely want to get To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. You might not be able to see that on the screen.
Yep.
And of course, was adapted by Robert Nemiroff. There's also Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry.
Imani Perry.
That was written by Imani Perry. You've already mentioned Lorraine Hansberry, The Life Behind a Raisin in the Sun by Charles J. Shields. Another one that came out, I absolutely love it when Black women write about me. And this is...
Radical Vision.
Yes. Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry by Soyika Diggs Colbert. This one came out in 2021. There's another one that's in the works as well. And there's, of course, this one, Conversations with Lorraine Hansberry, edited by Molly Godfrey. And the documentary Sighted Eyes, Feeling Heart, which came out in 2017.
Let's hear that.
The Black Theater, The Making of a Movement, which came out in 1978, features a segment on my impact on Black theater. And then, of course, the documentary on my dear friend Nina Simone, What Happened, Miss Simone, which came out in 2015, also discusses my influence on her. In fact, her song, Mississippi Goddamn, was influenced by me. There have been many television specials. Yes, so definitely my legacy endures. I was a complex woman. Yes, I was a lesbian. I loved women. I loved men. I loved Black. I loved white. I came from a middle class background and I spoke up for people who had less than I did. And I also enjoyed the trappings of wealth. I am all of those things. And all of those things are worth studying and some of them worth emulating. But perhaps not the cigarette smoking.
Yes. Health warning at the end. Yes. Stop the smoke. Yes. Thank you very much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedule to, sit with us and walk us through your life. And we're gonna break with tradition. Who are we having next week?
Well, in the tradition of women and resistance, because I was all about resistance, I'm so grateful that you all are doing these series because people need to study us, not just to celebrate our successes, but to understand the complexities. Because I think that when you look at your own life, you might also see that there's some parallels. Something that I did that I'm really astounded that I did as a young woman is I took myself seriously enough that I kept my writings. I journaled. I considered myself a writer and I wrote. I affirmed my work. And I think that that's something that too many of us are not doing in this day and age. And I would like to extol all of us. That tradition of reading, that tradition of studying, that tradition of finding a group of people that you can think critically with, people that challenge you and people whom you challenge. That tradition of fighting for our rights and not laying down, even though it cost us our life, because I believe racism killed my father, as it has killed so many other Black folk. But next week, I understand you're going to be covering someone who even predates me, and that is Nanny of the Maroons.
Maroons, yes.
And so, if you think my life was extraordinary, wait till you find out who Nanny of the Maroons was
Yes.
and why, if you're a Black woman, this is your time to rise up and to break free of the constraints and to live fully. And hopefully our men will come along.
That's it. Throwing out the gauntlets. Yes. That's throwing down the gauntlets. Yes.
But thank you for having me this evening, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to reintroduce myself.
Yeah, I mean, you've met, or better still, some new audience have found you, and hopefully they will explore the books, get to know Lorraine Hansberry more. And the thing about all of the people that we're going to be going through is they were not acting in isolation. You will find that as a result of one, you got to know somebody else, which is the idea of, even though you are the face, there's a community behind you.
I'm so glad you say that, because I know that eventually you're going to cover Claudia Jones.
Yes.
Claudia Jones and I were roommates. And I recall vividly when she was, so harassed by the FBI. And they eventually locked her up and then finally deported her. And can you imagine, without giving away her story yet, that Trinidad and Tobago, where she came from, that government, because again, Black people being controlled by whites, whether they're communists, socialists, oligarchs, whatever, that country refused to grant her entrance to back home. And it was ultimately the UK, where you currently are, that allowed her a place to go after she was deported. So we will talk about there's so many people's lives that intertwined with mine, so many people who impacted me and whom I impacted. But yes, we do not act alone.
Yeah. So it's next week. It's going to be Nanny, the Queen of the Maroons. So all you Caribbean folks, we're coming to the islands.
And on behalf of you as our host, I would ask all of our viewers, our listeners, please like, please subscribe, please share.
Yeah.
Why not?
Of course. And each one bring one. Don't just hug this experience alone, share it with somebody else. And we're talking about women. Women are essentially, as Thomas Sankara would say, they are the mothers of revolution.
And as I would say, we are everything. Thank you so much again for having me.